Marcus Webb was having what he considered a perfectly normal Tuesday morning on Nebula Prime Research Station, which meant he was elbow-deep in a malfunctioning gravity stabilizer, while 3 different alien species hovered around him like worried parents at a playground. "Careful with that plasma coupling, Marcus," chirped Dr. Quillen, her feathered crest twitching with anxiety. The Avarian scientist had a nervous habit of molting whenever she got stressed, which meant Marcus usually found colorful feathers in his toolkit by the end of each shift. One wrong move, and you could lose a limb. Or worse, cause a cascade failure that turns us all into space dust. Marcus grunted and continued working. "Doc, I've been doing this for 3 years. I think I can handle a basic stabilizer repair." "But humans are so fragile," Engineer Zoop added, his 6 arms gesticulating wildly as he spoke. The insectoid klaxon had once calculated that humans had a statistical likelihood of injury that was roughly equivalent to a soap bubble in a hurricane. "Perhaps we should wait for the automated repair drones?" "The drones are broken," Marcus replied, pulling out a corroded component. "Again. That's why I'm here." Captain Vextar, a towering reptilian warrior from the Draknari Empire, crossed his massive arms and let out a disapproving hiss. "In my culture, we would simply replace the entire stabilizer array. Why waste time with such delicate work when you could be injured?" Marcus paused his work and looked up at the 3 aliens staring at him with expressions ranging from mild panic to outright terror. This was his daily reality aboard Nebula Prime. Humans had only joined the Galactic Federation 15 years ago, and their reputation as the galaxy's most accident-prone species preceded them everywhere. According to galactic insurance databases, humans had a remarkable talent for finding new and creative ways to hurt themselves in zero-gravity environments. "Look, I appreciate the concern," Marcus said, wiping his hands on his coveralls. "But I'm not made of glass. I grew up on Earth. Do you know what we call a place where everything is constantly trying to kill you? Home." Dr. Quillen's feathers rustled nervously. "But Earth is classified as a death world in our databases. Surely you exaggerate." "Not really," Marcus shrugged. "We've got poisonous spiders, sharks, bears, wolves, snakes, hurricanes, earthquakes, and plants that can kill you just by touching them. Oh, and Australia exists, which is basically nature's way of saying, hey, let's put all the deadly stuff in one place and see what happens." The 3 aliens exchanged worried glances. This was exactly the kind of casual death world talk that made everyone nervous around humans. "Perhaps," Captain Vextar said slowly, "you should consider requesting a transfer to a safer position. Maybe something in communications, or filing, far from anything that could explode." Marcus just smiled and went back to his repairs. If they only knew what he'd left behind on Earth, they'd really lose their minds. But some secrets were better kept to himself, especially when it came to his rather unusual choice in pets. The emergency klaxons chose that exact moment to shatter the peaceful morning routine, filling the station with their ear-splitting wail. Red lights bathed the corridors in an ominous glow as the automated announcement system crackled to life. "All crew to battle stations, code red. Repeat, all crew to battle stations. Void stalker detected on approach vector. This is not a drill." Marcus watched with mild amusement as his 3 companions transformed from worried babysitters into full-blown panic mode. Dr. Quillen immediately began molting so rapidly that she looked like she was caught in a feather tornado. Engineer Zoop's 6 arms flailed in 6 different directions as he tried to simultaneously access 3 different control panels. Captain Vextar, despite being a proud warrior, had gone completely pale, which was quite an achievement for someone with green scales. "A void stalker," Vextar whispered, his voice barely audible over the alarms. "We're all going to die." "Oh, come on," Marcus said, not looking up from his work. "It's probably just a sensor glitch. When's the last time you calibrated the long-range scanners?" "Marcus," Dr. Quillen squawked, her voice reaching octaves that probably violated several noise ordinances. "Void stalkers are apex predators. They hunt entire fleets for sport. They're 20 meters of pure nightmare with tentacles and teeth and an appetite for destruction. The last ship that encountered one was found 3 days later, turned inside out." "Fascinating," Marcus replied, finally getting the stabilizer component loose. "Hand me that quantum spanner, would you, Zoop?" Zoop stared at him in disbelief. "Did you not hear what she said? Void stalker. As in the thing that makes seasoned space marines wet themselves and cry for their mothers." Marcus glanced at the tactical display, which was now showing a massive blip approaching at frightening speed. "Yeah, I heard. Still need that spanner, though." Captain Vextar began pacing, his claws clicking against the metal deck plates. "In all my years as a warrior, I have never faced a void stalker. My grandfather's grandfather told stories of them. They say their roar can shatter the hull of a dreadnought. They say they can smell fear from 3 star systems away. Really? Marcus asked, genuinely curious. That's quite a nose, or whatever they smell with. The tactical display started beeping more urgently as the approaching ship came into visual range. Through the viewports they could see a massive, organic-looking vessel that seemed to pulse with its own malevolent life. It was the kind of ship that looked like it had been grown rather than built, all curves and ridges and things that definitely shouldn't be moving but were. "It's docking," Zoop whispered, his compound eyes wide with terror. "It's actually docking with our station." The entire structure shuddered as the alien vessel attached itself to their docking bay with what sounded like a wet, squelching noise. Emergency lighting flickered, and somewhere in the distance, they could hear the unmistakable sound of bulkheads being forced open. "We should run," Dr. Quillen said, her voice barely a whisper. "We should run very, very far away." Marcus finally looked up from his repairs, wiping his hands on his coveralls again. "Or," he said calmly, "we could see what it wants. Maybe it's just lost." All 3 aliens turned to stare at him, like he'd suggested they should invite a supernova to dinner. The sound of approaching footsteps, if you could call them footsteps, echoed through the station corridors. It was more like the wet slap of something massive and slimy moving with purpose, punctuated by the occasional scrape of what could only be claws against metal. The emergency lighting cast dancing shadows that made everything look like a horror movie set. Dr. Quillen had given up all pretense of dignity and was now hiding behind a supply crate, her feathers scattered across the floor like confetti at the world's most terrifying party. Engineer Zoop had somehow managed to fold all 6 of his arms over his head in what appeared to be the klaxon equivalent of the fetal position. Even Captain Vexstar, proud warrior that he was, had drawn his plasma rifle with hands that were definitely not tremble, because Draknari warriors never tremble. The footsteps stopped just outside the maintenance bay. The door, which had been sealed in emergency lockdown, suddenly began to glow red-hot around the edges. Whatever was on the other side was cutting through 3 inches of reinforced titanium steel composite like it was tissue paper. Molten metal dripped to the floor with soft, hissing sounds. "This is it," Vexstar whispered, raising his weapon. "This is how we die. Eaten by a legend." Marcus set down his tools and dusted off his hands. "You know, you guys are being a bit dramatic. It's probably just—" The door exploded inward with a sound like thunder mixed with breaking glass. Through the smoke and debris stepped something that should not have been able to exist in a universe that made any sense whatsoever. The creature was massive, easily 4 meters tall and twice as wide, with a body that seemed to shift and flow like living shadow. Tentacles writhed around its form, each one thick as a tree trunk and covered in what looked like armored plates. Its head, if you could call it a head, was a nightmare of teeth and eyes and things that definitely shouldn't be there. When it opened what might charitably be called its mouth, rows upon rows of razor-sharp fangs became visible, each one the size of a dinner plate. Dr. Quillen fainted immediately, which was probably the smart choice. Zoop made a sound like a tea kettle having an existential crisis. Captain Vexstar's rifle clattered to the floor as his hands went completely numb. The creature filled its massive lungs, or whatever it used for breathing, and let out a roar that shook the entire station. It was the sound of dying stars and screaming metal and every nightmare you'd ever had about being eaten by monsters in the dark. The roar went on and on, rattling their bones and making their teeth ache. Emergency lights exploded in showers of sparks. Coffee cups fell off tables. Somewhere in the distance, hull plates groaned under the sonic assault. When the roar finally ended, the silence was somehow even more terrifying. The creature stood there, breathing heavily, clearly expecting the usual response of terror, fleeing and possibly some light begging for mercy. Its multiple eyes scanned the room, taking in the cowering aliens with what might have been satisfaction. Then it noticed Marcus. Marcus, who was still standing next to his repair station, looking mildly annoyed. Marcus, who had not flinched, not screamed, not even blinked during the roar that could supposedly shatter starship hulls. Marcus, who was now giving the galaxy's most feared predator a look that was part disappointment and part parental disapproval. "Brutus," Marcus said, his voice carrying the exact tone of someone who had just found their dog digging in the garbage. "What did I tell you about using your inside voice?" The massive creature froze. Its tentacles stopped writhing. Its eyes, all 14 of them, focused on Marcus with an expression that was rapidly shifting from predatory hunger to something that looked suspiciously like embarrassment. The creature made a sound. Not a roar this time, but a soft, almost musical chittering that sounded remarkably like an apology. The silence in the maintenance bay was so complete you could have heard a pin drop, if pins made any noise when they dropped in zero gravity. Captain Vextar's mouth was hanging open so wide that a small shuttle could have parked inside it. Engineer Zoop had somehow managed to turn 3 different shades of purple, which was impressive considering his species was normally a consistent shade of green. Dr. Quillen was still unconscious, which was probably for the best. Marcus walked over to the massive creature, completely ignoring the fact that it had enough teeth to open a dental supply store and tentacles that could crush a hover car. He reached up and patted what might have been its flank, though on a creature this size it was hard to tell where one body part ended and another began. "I know you missed me, boy," Marcus said, his voice carrying the same tone people usually reserved for talking to golden retrievers. "But you can't just go around terrorizing space stations. We've talked about this." The creature, apparently named Brutus, lowered its massive head until it was level with Marcus. Up close, those terrifying teeth didn't look quite so menacing. In fact, they looked almost sheepish. Brutus made that chittering sound again, and one of his tentacles gently wrapped around Marcus's waist, in what was unmistakably a hug. Okay, Marcus said, patting the tentacle. "I missed you too, but seriously, the whole dramatic entrance thing? We need to work on that." Captain Vextar finally found his voice, though it came out as more of a squeak than the commanding bellow he was going for. "Marcus, what in the 7 hells of Drachnos is happening here?" Marcus looked over at the captain, then back at Brutus, then sighed the kind of sigh that usually preceded a very long story. "Well, I suppose you're going to find out eventually. Everyone, meet Brutus. Brutus, these are my work friends. Try not to accidentally eat them." "Your work friends?" Zoop's voice had climbed several octaves. "Your work friends? Marcus, that is a Voidstalker. The Voidstalker. The one that's been terrorizing shipping lanes for the past 6 months." "Oh," Marcus said, looking genuinely surprised. "Have you been terrorizing shipping lanes, Brutus? That's not very nice." Brutus made a sound that was part whine, part rumble, and entirely pitiful. His tentacles drooped like a scolded dog's tail. "I found him about 8 years ago," Marcus explained, scratching behind what might have been Brutus's ear, though it was hard to tell on a creature with so many appendages. "He was just a little guy back then, about the size of a house cat, if house cats had tentacles and an appetite for raw meat." "Little guy?" Vextar repeated weakly. "Yeah, someone had dumped him in the woods behind my house on Earth. Can you believe that? Who abandons a perfectly good Voidstalker puppy?" Marcus shook his head in disgust. "Anyway, I couldn't just leave him there. He was crying and everything. Sounded like a broken air conditioning unit." The more Marcus talked, the more surreal the situation became. Here was a human, casually describing how he'd adopted what was essentially a space monster as a pet, and the space monster was responding to him like an overgrown puppy. "I had to house train him, of course," Marcus continued, oblivious to the fact that his audience was having collective mental breakdowns. "Do you know how hard it is to find a litter box for a creature that grows to the size of a small building? And don't get me started on the food bills. Brutus here can eat an entire cow in one sitting." Brutus perked up at the mention of food, his tentacles wiggling hopefully. "No, boy, we're not eating right now," Marcus said firmly. "We're having a conversation about your behavior. You can't just go around attacking spaceships because you're looking for me." "Attacking spaceships?" Zoop squeaked. "Oh, he wasn't really attacking them." Marcus waved a hand dismissively. "He was just trying to get their attention. Brutus has never been very good at communicating with other species. On Earth, he mostly just played fetch with tree trunks and chased the neighbors' cattle." The picture Marcus was painting was so absurd that it was almost believable. Almost. A Voidstalker that had been raised like a Earth dog, playing fetch and chasing livestock. It explained why the creature hadn't actually killed anyone during its supposed attacks. It had just been a very large, very lonely pet looking for its owner. "When I got this job," Marcus continued, "I had to leave him behind. I thought my neighbor would look after him, but apparently Brutus got out and decided to come find me. In space. Which, I have to admit, shows remarkable initiative for a pet." Brutus made a happy chittering sound and nuzzled Marcus's shoulder with his massive head, nearly knocking the human over. For a creature that could allegedly tear apart starships, he was being remarkably gentle. "So," Marcus said, looking around at his stunned colleagues, "anyone got any objections to me keeping him?" The question hung in the air like a particularly awkward family dinner conversation. Dr. Quillen chose that moment to regain consciousness, took one look at the massive creature still nuzzling Marcus, and immediately fainted again. Her feathers scattered across the floor like confetti at a surprise party nobody wanted to attend. "Objections." Captain Vextar's voice cracked like a teenager asking someone to prom. Marcus, that creature is classified as a galactic threat level 9. We have objections to its existence in general. Brutus apparently didn't appreciate being called a threat, because he turned his massive head toward Vextar and let out what could only be described as a hurt whimper. It was the kind of sound that would have been heartbreaking if it hadn't come from something with more teeth than a shark convention. Now you've hurt his feelings, Marcus said, giving Vextar a disapproving look. Brutus is very sensitive about his reputation, aren't you, boy? In response, Brutus began what could only be described as the galaxy's most terrifying display of excitement. His tentacles writhed happily, his eyes lit up with an inner glow, and he started bouncing. All 4 meters and several tons of him. Bouncing. Like a puppy. The station shook with each bounce. Emergency lights flickered. Somewhere in the distance, an alarm started going off, probably because the structural integrity sensors couldn't make sense of what was happening. Brutus, no bouncing indoors, Marcus said firmly. We've talked about this. You're not a little guy anymore. Brutus immediately stopped bouncing and looked sheepish, which was quite an achievement for a creature that looked like it had been designed by someone's worst nightmare. Wait, Engineer Zoop said, his voice still several octaves higher than usual. If he's been living in space for 6 months, where exactly has he been staying? Brutus perked up at this question and began making excited chittering sounds. He gently wrapped one of his tentacles around Marcus's waist and started moving toward the door. Oh, he wants to show you his ship, Marcus said, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. Come on, it's actually pretty impressive for someone with no opposable thumbs. The group followed Brutus through the corridors of the station, which suddenly felt much smaller with a 4-meter-tall apex predator taking up most of the space. Crew members who had been hiding in various alcoves and emergency shelters poked their heads out, saw the procession, and immediately ducked back into hiding. Marcus, Captain Vextar said nervously, when you say ship, what exactly do you mean? Oh, you'll see, Marcus replied cheerfully. They arrived at the main docking bay, where Brutus's vessel was attached to the station. Up close, it was even more disturbing than it had looked from a distance. The ship appeared to be organic, all curves and ridges and things that pulsed with their own rhythm. It looked less like a spacecraft and more like something that should have been floating in a very large aquarium. Is that ship alive? Zoop whispered. Not exactly, Marcus said. Brutus hollowed out an asteroid and kind of decorated it. He's always been artistic. Brutus led them through what appeared to be an airlock, though it looked more like a mouth than any mechanical device. The interior of the ship was a maze of tunnels and chambers, all seemingly carved by claws and tentacles. The walls were covered in what looked like scratch marks, but as they got closer, the marks resolved into patterns. Crude drawings, really, but recognizable ones. Are those pictures of you? Vextar asked, staring at the wall. Indeed, scratched into the asteroid walls were dozens of stick-figure drawings of a human. Some showed the human playing with a smaller creature. Others showed the human and creature together in various activities. It was like a gallery of happy memories, carved in stone by someone who had no concept of artistic technique, but plenty of love. He missed you, Dr. Quillen said quietly. She had regained consciousness again and was staring at the primitive artwork with something approaching wonder. Yeah, Marcus said, his voice softer now. I missed him too. Brutus made a happy sound and nuzzled Marcus again, careful not to knock him over this time. Then he began showing off his living space with obvious pride. There was a sleeping area filled with what looked like salvaged ship cushions and blankets, a feeding area with the remains of what might have been asteroid mining equipment, repurposed as food storage, and in the center of it all, a collection of objects that were clearly treasure. Are those my old socks? Marcus asked, staring at the collection. Brutus chittered happily and picked up a particularly ratty tube sock with one tentacle, offering it to Marcus like a cat bringing a dead mouse to its owner. He kept them, Marcus said, accepting the sock with the dignity of someone receiving a priceless artifact. He kept my old socks as mementos. Engineer Zoop made a sound that might have been crying. That's the most beautiful and terrifying thing I've ever seen. The tour continued, with Brutus proudly showing off his makeshift home. He had clearly been living here for months, surviving on salvaged supplies and the occasional asteroid mining operation. It was primitive, but it was also clearly the work of someone who had been trying very hard to be a good boy, while waiting for his human to come home. So, Marcus said, turning to his colleagues, I'm thinking we could set up a proper habitat for him, maybe convert one of the unused cargo bays? Captain Vextar stared at him. Marcus, are you seriously suggesting we turn a research station into a pet hotel for a void stalker? Well, Marcus said, scratching behind Brutus's ear, When you put it like that, it sounds kind of silly, but look at him. He's been living in a hollowed-out rock for 6 months eating asteroid debris, just hoping I'd find him. How can we say no to that face? They all looked at Brutus, who was gazing at Marcus with an expression of pure adoration. It was still a terrifying face, covered in teeth and far too many eyes, but there was something undeniably endearing about the way he looked at his human. Oh, for the love of... Vexstar threw up his hands. Fine, but if he eats anyone, I'm putting it in your performance review. 3 weeks later, Nebula Prime Research Station had undergone what the official reports diplomatically referred to as structural modifications to accommodate new crew member requirements. What the reports didn't mention was that those modifications included reinforcing half the station's bulkheads, installing a series of extra-large doors, and converting Cargo Bay 7 into what was essentially the galaxy's most expensive doghouse. Brutus had adapted to station life with the enthusiasm of someone who had spent 6 months living in a hollowed-out rock. He had his own quarters, his own feeding schedule, and his own job title. Chief Security Consultant Brutus, according to the official crew manifest, though Marcus suspected Captain Vexstar had only agreed to that to avoid having to explain the situation to Galactic Command. Morning, Brutus, Marcus said, entering the cargo bay with a steaming cup of coffee and what appeared to be half a space cow. How's the security business treating you? Brutus perked up at the sight of breakfast, his tentacles doing a happy wiggle dance. He had learned to control his strength around the smaller crew members, though there had been a few incidents. Dr. Quillen still fainted whenever he tried to shake hands, but that was more habit than actual fear at this point. Engineer Zoop had discovered that Brutus was surprisingly good at holding complicated repair equipment, which had revolutionized their maintenance procedures. Any security reports to file? Marcus asked, settling down next to his massive pet. Brutus made a series of chittering sounds that Marcus had learned to interpret as all quiet on the Western Front, but I chased away 3 supply drones because they looked suspicious. Good boy, Marcus said, scratching behind what he had decided was Brutus's ear. Though we've talked about the supply drones, they're supposed to be here. The comm system crackled to life. Marcus Webb to the bridge, please. Marcus Webb to the bridge. Marcus sighed and finished his coffee. Duty calls, boy. Try not to terrorize any visiting dignitaries while I'm gone. On the bridge, Captain Vexstar was pacing back and forth in front of the main view screen, which showed an approaching Federation vessel. Dr. Quillen was at her science station, her feathers only slightly ruffled, which Marcus had learned meant she was having a good day. Engineer Zoop was monitoring the station's systems, all 6 of his arms working different control panels with practiced efficiency. Ah, Marcus, Vexstar said, turning as he entered. We have a situation. That's a Federation inspection vessel approaching. They're here to investigate reports of the Void Stalker attacks. Oh, Marcus said. Should I hide Brutus? Where exactly would you hide a 4-meter-tall tentacle monster? Dr. Quillen asked. Good point, Marcus conceded. So what's the plan? We tell them the truth, Vexstar said, surprising everyone, that we've neutralized the threat through innovative diplomatic solutions. Diplomatic solutions? Zoop repeated. Well, we did negotiate a treaty, Vexstar said defensively. The terms were regular meals, belly rubs, and a place to sleep in exchange for not eating anyone and providing security services. The Federation ship docked without incident, and soon a small group of officials were being escorted through the station. Marcus had briefed them on the situation, though he'd left out some of the more unbelievable details. The lead inspector, a stern-looking Volcarian named Commander Thex, seemed skeptical, but professional. And you're telling me, Commander Thex said, that the creature responsible for terrorizing 3 shipping lanes has been neutralized through pet adoption? Essentially, yes, Marcus replied, though we prefer to think of it as interspecies cooperation. They reached Cargo Bay 7, where Brutus was demonstrating his security skills by carefully examining a supply manifest with 1 tentacle while simultaneously organizing repair tools with 3 others. He looked up as they entered and made a polite chittering sound that Marcus had taught him was the equivalent of hello. Commander Thex stared at the scene for a long moment. That's a Void Stalker. His name is Brutus, Marcus said proudly. Brutus, say hello to the nice Federation officers. Brutus dutifully raised 1 tentacle in what was clearly meant to be a wave. Several of the Federation officers stepped back, but Commander Thex stood her ground. Extraordinary, she murmured. The files on Voidstalkers describe them as untamable apex predators. Well, Marcus said, maybe nobody ever tried asking nicely. The inspection continued for another hour, with Brutus demonstrating his various skills. He could detect approaching ships before the sensors did, identify structural weaknesses in the station's hull, and apparently had an excellent memory for faces, which made him an ideal security consultant. By the time the Federation officials left, they seemed convinced that Nebula Prime had indeed solved their Voidstalker problem through unconventional means. "Well," Captain Vextar said, watching the Federation ship depart, "that went better than expected." "I told you Brutus would make a good impression," Marcus said. "Speaking of which," Dr. Quillen said, looking up from her station, "I've been analyzing the communication logs from his ship. Marcus, there's something you should know about Brutus's species." "What's that?" "Voidstalkers are highly intelligent, more intelligent than we initially thought, and they're not actually apex predators by choice. They're more like highly advanced space whales. They only attack when they're threatened or protecting their territory." Marcus looked thoughtful. "So Brutus was never really dangerous?" "Oh, he's still dangerous," Dr. Quillen said quickly. "But he's dangerous the way a guard dog is dangerous. Protective, not predatory." "That makes sense," Marcus said. "He was always good with the neighbors' kids back on Earth." The conversation was interrupted by the comm system crackling to life again. "Marcus Webb to Cargo Bay 7, please. We have a situation." Marcus sighed and headed back to check on Brutus, followed by the others. They found him in his quarters, looking agitated and making concerned chittering sounds while staring at the view screen. "What's wrong, boy?" Marcus asked. Brutus pointed at the screen with one tentacle. On it was a news report about strange sightings near the Outer Rim territories. Ships reported being followed by massive creatures, though no attacks had been reported. "More Voidstalkers?" Vextar asked. "Looks like it," Marcus said, studying the footage. "Brutus, do you know those guys?" Brutus made a series of complex sounds that Marcus had learned meant, sort of, but it's complicated. "They're looking for mates," Dr. Quillen said suddenly, her feathers bristling with excitement. "The communication patterns match mating calls. They're looking for other Voidstalkers." Marcus looked at Brutus, who was now making what could only be described as embarrassed sounds. "Brutus, buddy, is there something you haven't told me?" The massive creature made a sound that was part whine, part rumble, and entirely sheepish. "Oh," Marcus said, understanding dawning. "You're not the only one, are you?" Captain Vextar looked between Marcus and Brutus with growing alarm. "Marcus, please tell me you're not thinking what I think you're thinking." Marcus grinned and scratched behind Brutus's ear. "Well, he's been awfully lonely. I did always say he needed a friend." "No," Vextar said firmly. "Absolutely not. One Voidstalker is enough." "But Captain," Marcus said, his grin widening, "think of the security applications. Besides, there's something else I should probably mention about my pets back on Earth." "What?" Dr. Quillen asked, though she sounded like she didn't really want to know. "Well, I may have mentioned that Brutus isn't actually the biggest pet I've ever had." The bridge fell silent except for the hum of the life support systems. "Marcus," Engineer Zoop said slowly, "what exactly is the biggest pet you've ever had?" Marcus's grin became positively mischievous. "Let's just say that if you think a Voidstalker is impressive, wait until you meet a Terran dragon." The silence stretched on for a very long time. Finally, Captain Vextar spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Marcus, please tell me you're joking." Marcus just smiled and headed back to his quarters, whistling cheerfully. Behind him, Brutus made a happy chittering sound that sounded suspiciously like laughter. In the distance, 3 alien crew members could be heard having what might charitably be called a collective nervous breakdown. And somewhere in the Outer Rim, other creatures were still searching for their lost packmate, unaware that he had found something better than a pack. He had found a family. Even if that family was still adjusting to having a 4-meter-tall tentacle monster as their newest member.